Welcome to the Plastic Pills Podcast, episode 148, at least of the Pill Pod episodes. I am your host, Pills, joined by my co-hosts, Victor.
Yes.
Eric.
Hello.
Good job, guys. We're getting this in 148 and some episodes in, and we are getting the intros down.
Yeah, I think you could just record that one and replay it every time. That was good.
All right. So we have been dealing with stupid prefixes to academic words and continuing with our tradition, finished off metamodernism. Now we're doing anti-philosophy, which I felt was much less flippant and stupid. But before we get to anti-philosophy proper, I wanted to say I went down another small rabbit hole reading stuff for this episode because I kept getting recommended clicks, and there's just so many of these. We maybe a whole episode or a whole series of episodes could be done. I'm not saying we'll do it, but it could be done on these manifestos and goddamn just like calls for the renewal of the humanities or the renewal of the discipline or the renewal of philosophy to recover some old greatness that we've lost. The recovery of systems building, another one. But people have been writing this shit for like 150 years. I think it started probably with make theology great again. So why are they saying this? No one's listening. Do you think some university president who became the university president so they can hire their brother's construction company to build the new basketball stadium, do you think they're reading your call for the renewal of the humanities?
Absolutely. That was very specific.
Well, have the humanities been crushed? Like, I don't know. Like, is it? I don't, like, that's another thing that I'm not so sure about. Like these rumors of its decline in the university. Like, I guess there's some truth to it, but I also feel like often those are like a little over exaggerated.
I think funding has been drastically cut. Enrollment is very low, and a lot of if we're talking anti-philosophy, that's stuff that responds to what's going on now. And a lot of these manifestos now usually cite, STEM, the promotion of STEM above and beyond any other discipline. Like Obama has said it, presidents say it, STEM is the most important thing. We got to invest in STEM. And
wasn't this, though, like a Cold War policy?
And then the other thing would be the neoliberalization of the universities. The humanities is a quote unquote useless discipline. Philosophy is non-instrumental, and so it tends not to attract investment on its own.
I know that that's what people say, but I don't think it's true. Like at least not the extent to which. So there's actually a book about getting work in the academic job market that came out maybe a few years ago called Good Work If You Can Get It, and he actually like goes through a bunch of the stats on this. Where is it? And like it seems like it's a lot of it's like really overblown. Like when you actually look at the enrollment numbers. So this book was published in, let's see here, 20. Like I understand the reasoning of what you're saying. Like it kind of makes sense, but when you actually look at the number, 2020. But like he has a lot of really persuasive things to say. Like people say this, right? There's like this feeling. They're like, oh, like people are encouraging STEM. They're paying lip service. When you actually look at the numbers in terms of enrollment and like money that different departments get, it's actually not true. Like I think there's like a really interesting stat about how English departments actually get like a kind of a shot, like the amount of money that they spend per grad student or something like that is actually like a lot, like more than like science STEM grad students.
Oh, you're gonna bring numbers into it. Oof. I don't know what metrics you're looking at. That sounds like a per capita funding, but at least the opening prise de feu of this article that I was looking at says basically since 2007 enrollment in both history and English is down pretty much 50%, which is pretty huge for less than 20 years.
I mean, that's the type of kind of position you hear, like, because obviously that goes against so many things I've read by academics and so much of what I see on the news. And I see this truth of that STEM is promoted and the humanities are not. But I mean, I've heard stats that go for the humanities in decline argument. And for the reasons now, I mean, it's always seems like it's in crisis, but I mean, for the reasons in the present.
I mean, that's what I've always heard, though. I've always heard that narrative, right?
But I mean, yeah, it's a kind of opens up the temptation for a skeptical position. Oh, the humanities.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't
really
say that they're not in trouble, but they're not.
But then that's like, oh, really? So does that just mean they're intrinsically less valuable, or there's just nothing wrong with them, and all this is kind of just weird?
Well, look, over 100 years ago, Husserl wrote the same book that philosophy matters. Actually, philosophy matters.
Exactly.
The
That's what I'm
most.
kind of saying.
Always
If you're
been in
doing
crisis.
science, then you need to be doing philosophy first, because if you're doing science, you actually have a philosophy, even if you don't recognize it.
Then it just has perpetually a reputation for being in crisis without being in crisis.
It seems to me like it's kind of in crisis. It seems like it's kind of useless. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many calls, I guess, for how to renew it on every person's idiosyncratic personal program that they want to save everything by propagating.
It's interesting, but it seems like a contrarian perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I was genuinely surprised when I read it because I wasn't reading the book for that reason. Like I'm on the academic job market right now, so I was genuinely like reading it like for advice regarding that, and then I was surprised when I came across that section.
Well, Badiou wrote a manifesto for philosophy, which was kind of a thing in the 80s and 90s.
They came back.
Yeah.
The manifestos are the modernist things.
Well, Deleuze wrote what is philosophy book also. Although Badiou is he's not very romantic about it. He's not doing a renew in the way that these annoying articles keep trying to do a renew. He's kind of saying philosophy has always had a very specific job, and we should stop calling anti-philosophy philosophy. So welcome to the anti-philosophy episode.
It seems like he's still committed as a philosopher, though, but he thinks anti-philosophy is like also important.
And don't be the wrong kind of philosopher like Deleuze, because Deleuze is a philosopher of the one, which is a bad thing. It says logic of worlds.
The one, the multiple.
I think my hypothesis is better, that philosophy has always been self-help, and people didn't want to recognize it as such. And then when we actually got a self-help industry created in large part by like post-hippies and Oprah, then philosophy didn't really have a job anymore. So all these calls to renew are trying to figure out what philosophy's job actually is, and finding out that it's kind of extraneous. It's a little bit of a luxury that you dabble in on the side, which is just a repeat like of Husserl's complaint. It's a disciplinary specialization, and then going, well, what the hell am I for?
Yeah.
I say on a philosophy podcast.
Yeah. One of the worst things that can happen to a philosophical enterprise is that it become institutionalized and caught up in the disciplinary structure of knowledge. He says its absorption or incorporation into academic knowledge is the worst possible risk for the fate of their discipline.
So the professionalization of philosophy?
Yeah, institutionalization, professionalization, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's always had knowledge for knowledge's sake, science, philosophy, and then for the betterment of humankind. It seems to me it's been torn between those two goals.
Well, I don't think any of us would be called philosophers, right? In his sense, in his idiosyncratic definition, reinscribing the boundaries of what philosophy is and is not.
Well, it depends. Like, what are the philosophers to the anti-philosophers? As we said, we went over these examples. You know, like if Descartes is a philosopher, then Pascal was the anti-philosopher. If I guess the encyclopedists like Diderot were philosophers, then Rousseau is anti-philosopher. You know, Parmenides, Heraclitus, anti-philosopher. So I guess it depends. Are you a Parmenides, a Descartes?
Nietzsche, anti-philosopher. Lacan, anti-philosopher. Wittgenstein,
Hegel, philosopher, right? Kierkegaard, anti-philosopher, right? Are you a Hegel?
This is such a stupid divide.
When he lines it up like this, I'm like, all the good ones are the anti-philosophers anyway.
Yeah,
so
they get all the best.
I'll just go over to that side.
It's like the best rock stars are all in hell.
Yeah, this is a stupid division, I think. Ultimately, my view is this is a made up distinction. I think they're all philosophers. I think like philosophy is simply always in the business of
All distinctions are made up.
No, I don't. I think that this is just a useless distinction. Like it's really like, I mean, I think it's a useless distinction because I think it's misleading. It makes it sound like what they're trying to do is more radical than I think it actually is. I think that philosophy has always been in the business of undermining views that came before them. I think this is totally in the business of that. I think, Nietzsche is kind of a hyper modernist in a way by like taking the insights from modernity and pushing them beyond. I just don't think that, I think it's misleading to say it's anti-philosophy because it makes it sound like it's something different. And I think ultimately they're doing the same thing. They're doing a radical form of questioning that is welcome in philosophy. And I agree. I tend to prefer, in many cases, the anti-philosophers. I just think this is a stupid made-up distinction that is misleading. They're all philosophers.
Well, you have to read Badiou in his own terms, though, because he gives specific qualifications for what he means by philosophy versus non-philosophy.
Yeah, there's like metaphysics, basically, right? It's like, yeah, people who are trying to find metaphysics and people who reject it.
No, I wouldn't say that. It's not really to do with metaphysics. It's to do with his definition of truth, because the philosopher is someone who uses a truth procedure that is particular to philosophy, as opposed to an anti-philosopher who you put some other endeavor above philosophy, whether that's aesthetics or politics. And the truth procedure then is less important than their other endeavor or their other ultimate goal. I think you can say in the case of Nietzsche, this would be an aesthetic goal.
Yeah, it's more like it is what you were saying. Anti-philosophy, he's naming it almost as a separate tradition. So you're right, like he's separating it from philosophy. What you're saying is philosophy's own willingness, you were announcing it in the kind of Enlightenment wet dream way where it's like self-correcting enterprise, but he's separating the anti-philosophy. So yeah, it's more of a gesture in that way, but it's still this kind of, antagonist and agonistic relationship you have.
I agree. I mean, it's reacting to a certain way of doing philosophy.
Anti-philosophers question the fundamentals and the foundations and the value of philosophy as an enterprise.
Which is the most philosophical thing to do.
Which is like a challenge. Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, he's giving it a different name.
You understand, though, he's not being diminutive of anti-philosophy. He says, like, philosophy has to contend with Lacan if philosophy is going to be anything ever.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like it's provocative and it's supposed to be something beneficial to philosophy if philosophy can sort of meet the challenge and not ossify as it does in, say, academic structures, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with like the basics of what he's saying. I just think I just think like the term itself, I've got to quibble more with the term. I think it's misleading, but I understand what he's saying.
I think it's like his take on this too. It's like him forging a unique take on this subject too. So yeah, like I wouldn't use his term maybe, but I think it's an interesting suggestion to give it its own name.
If we take it like this, for example, the truth procedure, which is pretty central. We've talked about Badiou, I think, only once on this podcast before, and it was in the context of communism, because communism is a truth or a kind of event. But we have like Husserl and Heidegger and Badiou, and they all, or early Heidegger, I should say, but they want philosophy to be a kind of procedure. For Husserl, it's seeking the transcendental ground from which to observe whatever else, including science. Heidegger's asking the question of being, and for Badiou, it's not confusing these truth procedures with other procedures that kind of look like truth procedures. So what an anti-philosopher does is, instead of saying philosophy is the highest truth procedure, they kind of put something else in its place, whether it's aesthetics or politics. So he wants to very, very narrowly, I guess you'd say, very narrowly define philosophy from these things that really look very close to it.
Some of the ways he was characterizing it too reminded me of our Biener episode, right? What Biener was calling dangerous minds, or this is the anti-philosophers, is at least for Nietzsche. I guess that could extend to the others too, but yeah, dangerous minds.
Would you make that comparison
No,
though?
but
Because Biener was just saying they're dangerous because your 18-year-old nephew might turn into a fascist if he reads them.
Yeah, because Biener, I don't think has a problem in principle with.
yeah. I mean, it has a different political thrust.
Yeah, it has a different political thrust, but
What's
that's
that?
really his concern. I don't think his concern has much to do with like questions of how the philosophy
No,
is being done.
he's not interested in like at least in that characterization, he's not interested in the ideas, but in their consequences.
But can I say here, like a little bit this Western chauvinism point, which I don't like to make very often because it's kind of a cheap point, but it's almost saying there's this definition of philosophy and that it's almost not contingent, that it's just based on these truth procedures that appeared suddenly from nowhere. And I might be an anti-philosopher for drawing attention to it, but we read Anaximander, and Anaximander is a philosopher, but we read how difficult it is to distinguish what he's saying from the mythological literature of the time. And then you have got like, I don't know, stuff I don't know anything about, but Indian philosophy, the Buddha, Taoism, even ancient Egypt, where the Greeks were saying like straight up, we got all this shit from ancient Egypt. So I don't know how you separate like Plato all of a sudden from the sort of wisdom, life literature, you follow the teachings. Isn't this hard-boiled truth concept relatively late in the game of what we'd call philosophy? Because like I said, with Anaximander that we just read, philosophy is basically indistinguishable from something you'd call wisdom teaching.
One interesting way, I guess we could start looking at characteristics of anti-philosophers, right? And anti-philosophers put the philosophizing aside and they supposedly embody what philosophy is supposed to be talking about. So somebody like Socrates, right, who was just relentlessly questioning and never wrote anything, at least Plato's Socrates, right? Plato's presenting Socrates as this person who almost like embodies the values of philosophy, and then Plato's just kind of writing about them as, or somebody like, sleeping by the market so they can be so like living
Yeah.
the principles of philosophy, even like Nietzsche, right? Like fashioning your life as a work of art, like as we were talking about last time, like consciously and affirmatively overcoming the kind of like, or at least doing that eternal return of the same experiment. Whenever you make a kind of decision, you have to encounter that impossibility of affirming it for its all eternity or something. Like it's a very effusive and nowness kind of thing as well, to be an anti-philosopher in relationship to philosophy.
Yeah, but by making all these definitions, here's the boundary, here's the marked space, there's the unmarked space, and we have marked space competing with each other. Badiou is the kind of dude that, like, if you're hearing this and you're wondering if you need to buy in, you kind of need to buy in completely. I'd say you need to be struck by this project and then accept it. And then if you don't, you're not going to find much use for it. Like, I was immediately put off personally because the first things I read from Badiou were about math and how math is this transcendental, I don't even know how to call it. It deals with ontology, apparently. And I find math hard.
Ontological set theory.
Yes, I find math hard, and therefore I dislike it. And then the other thing he talks about all the time is religion, which I find tedious and arbitrary. So I was just put off by it at the start. But if you do like math stuff and truth stuff, I guess this is for you. Alan Sokal Alan Sokal weighed in on Badiou and said that his interpretation of set theory was quote unquote preposterous. So I don't know if Alan Sokal is the guy to be listening to on this.
Well, set theory has been, as we've seen, I think set theory has been embattled almost since its beginning. So it's not surprising that Sokal would channel intuitionism and bash it. But set theory, I mean, it really reminded me of what he was talking about in the Wittgenstein as an anti-philosopher, but among philosophers, some of them are anti-philosophers, and they kind of remind philosophy of various things that it might be in danger of missing.
What we can say about Badiou, to briefly summarize where he stands, he's contemporaries with, the Deleuze wrote a book on Deleuze that is not very good, but contemporaries with Althusser, or a student of Althusser, and was a reader of Lacan. He was a militant Maoist for the 70s and 80s. And he's committed, unlike those contemporaries, he really wants like a position for truth. And to get to what Badiou means by truth is, I think, kind of important to start with, because it defines philosophy. So the truth is universal and it's abstract, but it is contemporaneous, or it arrives with events. So he's got this book. The main claim to fame, I'd say, is being an event. And events evolve, or they produce subjects and they produce truths. And they're not really seen as possible before occurring. So they from nothing erupt. And then the job of the subject is to commit to events. The main one being revolution in an abstract sense, whatever revolution you could think of, like Christianity even, as being revolutionary. So it's not possible.
The French Revolution.
It's not possible at one point in time, and then after the fact, it kind of defines an entire discourse, an entire procedure that comes after it. And this fidelity to the event, it's very temporal, but it's not truth in the way that we would use truth to say something like, oh, it's just a name for everything that is. Truth is kind of a production or an eruption.
Yeah, that was an interesting point.
And philosophers remain committed to this, while anti-philosophers, they want to, suture is his term for it, but they want to graft it off into minor discourses. They want to talk about aesthetics, so they want to talk about politics, instead of this narrow commitment to the truth.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like cutting off the king's head is an event that's like in principle impossible. He points to these like very extreme things, like or like a Stalinistic kind of imposition or a ban, right? Like it's something that's supposed to be by definition impossible. So it makes it an event.
Like no one could imagine it?
Yeah, like the conditions of possibility were sort of impossible until they're revealed. They would prescribe that act, right? And I think anti-philosophy is there to remind philosophy of the act, which is opposed, which is not the proposition. It's like radically opposed to the philosophical proposition. So when we say philosophy is inscribed in that history of truth that you're talking about, all of philosophy is inscribed in it, and anti-philosophy sort of flips the that value binary there, I guess, and moves truth out of the privileged position in various ways, like with Nietzsche, right? Truth is just the mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. It like radically subverts philosophy. From the perspective of now, he says there's two things that it reminds philosophy of: the conditions of philosophy, which are always contemporary with it. The conditions of philosophy are always contemporary. It's a confusion of their own time that philosophers construct new concepts.
I had a bit of trouble with this definition because I don't really get what the eternality bit is adding to truth. Truths are eternal because they are like historically contingent, but their historical contingency points also to their universality, but the universality is only known anachronistically. So it seems like the question of epistemology here, maybe I'm misreading it, I don't know, but the question of epistemology is being elided here where the thing is just being declared eternal, abstract, universal, despite the fact that it occurs in the event, and then you can only name it that stuff after the fact. It seems like you don't need to do both at the same time. Why don't you just call the thing contingent? I guess if you believe it to be contingent, then you're less likely to be faithful and to commit to it. But then, I don't know. Is it eternal, or is it just a matter of belief in the truth's eternality?
Well, the way I gathered it from it takes a lot in the Wittgenstein Antiphilosophy book, right? There's a distinction between substance and world, right? The world is where things happen, but philosophers use propositions to describe substance, what is possible, what could possibly happen. And when we describe any state of affairs, it's what could possibly happen. And it's eternal, right? Possibility is a possibility. If it does happen, it means it was always possible. But that possibility depends on actualization in the world. So you have that substance, eternal possibilities, actual in the world, where sense points to the world.
Oh, so the eternality points to the substance, not... Okay, that's Leibniz, isn't it? Yeah. Oh, I didn't read it that way. That makes sense, though. Neat.
How would you characterize in this kind of division, where would you put set theory? Or sorry, not set theory, systems theory.
On the side of, possibilities, but I think it pays very close attention to the actualization of possibilities. Seeing those two things, the operation of a system.
But do you think systems theory is trying to do metaphysics?
It's kind of an anti-philosophy in a way, I think, yeah.
Systems theory is not concerned with a truth procedure. It's concerned with procedure itself. So I guess in that way, it's not philosophy. Okay. But Victor, I wanted to ask, you said is this just metaphysics that he's arguing is philosophy? Do you think that he's arguing for metaphysics specifically as philosophy?
Yeah, I think that there's it seems like he's trying to say that there is a certain kind of hunt for truth is real philosophy, I guess, or traditional philosophy. And then those that question that, I guess, truth procedure. I only read the short piece. So a lot of the stuff you guys are saying, I don't know, because I haven't done any serious reading on Badiou, but that's what it sounded like, at least in the short piece.
Yeah, anti-philosophy kind of questions the basic orientation of philosophy, and yeah, it reminds it of the two things I mentioned, the conditions of doing philosophy are always now and contemporary, and that the philosophy speaks from a place of authority, privileged place of authority. It has to remind philosophy of that, lest they forget the contemporary and the authority of the voice conditions.
This is what I liked most about Badiou, and I still find it kind of inspiring, is that unlike some sort of additive discourse of truth to get a whole bunch of different tests done in different places to come up with a final answer, his version of truth is always condition dependent. So philosophy in any event or post any event, and there are very few events, by the way. We should suggest that events are very rare, but when they happen explosively. But I really like his description of philosophy as being this very contained answer to certain events, as rare as they are. So this is why you can never come up with a sum total truth if you align up all the propositions that have made through history, from Plato to Rousseau. Wait, is Rousseau a philosopher or an anti-philosopher? He's an anti-philosopher.
He's anti, yeah.
Okay, so we'll go with Montaigne or something. If we add up these discrete approbations of truth, we're never going to get to a sum total, which is why philosophy has a different purpose in any situation. And I kind of like that. I kind of buy that it's very much processual and context dependent. But I can't really... I'm having a hard time grasping what he means by the universality, which is in some way connected to set theory, which I don't get. But there's a nothing, and the nothing is supposedly this, I can't even say ground. It's a less than a ground where these procedures are supposed to be arriving from. And it kind of, I don't know, it sounds like he's trying to hitch his wagon to the mathematics train, just because mathematics is a little bit more reliable than the contingent historical conditions that produce philosophy. And I kind of don't know why he's doing that. But I'm too dumb to understand math, so maybe that's why
I really see it in the Wittgenstein book, why he's hitching it to that wagon, right? Because, set theory was at the basis of, formalizing mathematics. That was the point of set theory, was kind of like, mathematical symbolism and coming up with the basic sets of statements that all mathematics is engaging in and symbolizing them, and then figuring out the basic propositions or axioms upon which like a consistent and complete mathematical, that whole like pre-Gödel's incompleteness theorem stuff. And the tractatus is in that tradition of logical positivism, so I can see why that stuff is relevant here. Don't see it so much in like Nietzsche.
I found out his dad was a mathematician.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe he's trying to make his dad happy by reincorporating mathematics into philosophy. But no, like you'd expect, or at least I totally expected on reading this Wittgenstein thing, that he's going to be going after the late Wittgenstein when he's like talking about language games and all that stuff. But no, he goes after
the tractatus,
the analytical magnum opus of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, which I've never read. I never will read. But Eric, can you explain a little more why is Wittgenstein at his most procedural? Why is that anti-philosophy?
Yeah, Badiou's pretty clear about this, saying, the Tractatus is the one work I'm going to deal with here. It's the only thing he thought was fit to be published. The fundamental insights he comes to with this book are muddled and sort of he goes off them by the philosophical. Yeah, he's very by the investigations. Yeah, he's very adamant that what Wittgenstein formulates in the Tractatus, which is, again, like, Wittgenstein is a huge fan of Frege. He's even sent this manuscript to him when Frege was completely baffled, I think. And he worked with Bertrand Russell too, whose sort of logical atomism is what Wittgenstein inherited in this text. It's the atomism. So the atomism is about getting down to the bottom, the basic statements again, right? Like I was saying, that you can sort of formalize a language with. But obviously, he's got very different aims than that sort of mathematical logic project.
And just for clarity's sake, by atomism, you mean the value of propositions in logic, right?
Yeah, like analyzing propositions down to their atomic elements, basically, which means, I think in terms, it's in the terms of that text, it's objects. Propositions contain terms, and terms are objects and names for objects. And so the smallest sort of atom is a valueless object that gets sort of combined up in propositions. And then propositions are, facts, statements of facts, sayings of facts.
I'm having nightmares from taking symbolic logic.
Yeah. That's why Wittgenstein is so quotable too, because it's all just like very apodictic statements and axioms, and very almost like Nietzschean aphoristic style too. So he's very strange in his style, and Wittgenstein's style is very unique and strange.
But throughout this process, the reason that the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, and I'm sorry, I really apologize to the listeners. This is not an easy listening episode. But the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus is accused here of not being committed to truth, but rather being committed to sense. And sense in the sense of the propositions as their own system, as opposed to what Badiou is calling truth, which is not the logical truth, right? Because the logical truth here would be the sense making through propositions, which is something that the later Wittgenstein said, I'm quitting that shit anyway. But when we talk about sense instead of truth, then we're actually combining like two former senses of what we would call truth. Truth meaning the thing that is true for all time. If things are as they are, then we can use propositions to describe them. They can be true or false, which is they make sense. And the reason Badiou turns on this is saying we don't want sense from propositions. We want truth from propositions. So despite the fact that this is considered by the analytic tradition, at least Bertrand Russell at the time, to be one of the greatest texts ever written, Badiou's going to take issue with it in that it's distracting, you could say, or it's not furthering the cause of truth. It's furthering the cause of sense making in language, which speaks to his more broad turn in terms of his peers and his contemporaries. He's not interested in this linguistic shit. He wants to go to a different level, the procedural production of events, rather than whether language makes sense or not.
Yeah, I think it's obvious from Wittgenstein's very, we've probably heard a lot of sound bites of his very like sort of hostile statements towards philosophy, like nonsense. It's all nonsense and babble.
But this all comes later, right?
I think there's some of that in this as well. There's some of that in the Tractatus as well. One of the first quotes, what is it? Most of the propositions and questions to be found in philosophical works are not false, but nonsensical. Well, that's one of the first quotes that Badiou drops from Wittgenstein into his text here. So most are nonsensical. So how does philosophy produce this nonsense? And then locating that nonsense, that babble, is actually what the expansiveness, like that's that operation that anti-philosophy is supposed to perform. It's like, I think of it as a detotalizing. And he divides it into three operations and says, can we find these three sort of detotalizing operations in Wittgenstein's oeuvre? Well, let's look in the Tractatus. We'd best find it there. And there's sort of three operations that constitute anti-philosophy and its challenge to philosophy. At least Badiou thinks he's sort of distilled these three operations that anti-philosophy performs, and he's going to find them now in Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And so it's a pretty, there's a lot, they're complicated operations. They're not for listing.
Yeah, this is not easy listening. Bruno Bastiles writes like an introduction that's basically as long as the book.
It's huge.
But if we leave Wittgenstein aside for a second, because we're playing way too much inside baseball, I guess what these anti-philosophers do is say philosophy in our time is doing this one thing, and that's all bullshit. It's based on shifting foundations. Maybe Derrida, for our listeners, might be a better example.
Well, he sees sophistry as an example of anti-philosophy, right? Sophistry, like just full on.
No, that's not true.
Adopting.
He splits sophistry from anti-philosophy. Because sophistry is just fake.
Well, they might use the resources. I guess it's more like he says anti-philosophy might delve into the resources that sophistics exploit as well, right? So it's that this idea, I mean, the Nietzsche's idea of overturning of all values, that would be like an anti-philosophical kind of statement there. Or using sophistics.
The sophists, they just deal in doxa, which is opinion, and it has no relation to the truth whatsoever. But the anti-philosophers are more advanced than that in that they attack philosophy's supposed truth procedures.
Yeah,
So they are a much more
Socrates.
credible opponent. Like Diogenes is a more credible opponent than the other sophists.
Yeah, like a Socratic questioning, I guess, would be more a better example.
Well, for example, he also says that the tractatus is anti-philosophy, but that late Wittgenstein, so the investigations, descended into sophistry.
Yeah, that would be like an anti-philosophical operation.
I mean, this seems all very exciting, but like I said before, you have to really buy into this project to really fall or get anything out of it.
Yeah, it is destructive.
He goes on to what is a truth procedure or things like that. This is unfolding. It unfolds in 4 stages. You have nomination, which is to name the disruption. Then it intervenes. Then you have to pay fidelity to it. And then you have to force it to be discussed. So at any point along the line, if you have a problem with his terminology and his laying out of these procedures, which you may or may not, but in the same way that Heidegger lays out an existential analytic, if at any point you want to jump off and do something different or bring something else in, then it just seems like you lose the point of the project. You don't need to decide what fits and what doesn't fit because he's just going to tell you before you even start. Maybe that makes me an anti-philosopher, which is a label I'd be proud to burden myself with.
Yeah, I think like just radically questioning, like when we say things like what use is philosophy, you know, ideas, who cares kind of stuff, right? Like that appropriately done, that can be like an anti-philosophical kind of project, is to sort of really radically challenge and say, you know, how is this helping? But like anti-philosophy is almost like an inversion. You know, it's very individualistic, like Nietzsche. It's very anti-philosophy, like it's very much concerned with challenging philosophy.
So here's an example. You have Lacan, right? Lacan's subject, decentered split. Its desire is its desire, but it's also the desire of the other. So it's not contained. It's not identified as a thing. This presents a huge problem for philosophy, but in a good way. Like you have to be able to answer Lacan's subject with a philosophical subject in order for philosophy to be relevant at all. And he does this. He says, instead of, you know, the subject of who the fuck ever, Kant or Descartes, we don't need that subject because our subject has to answer today. And his example of this is the subject it's not permanent, it's not eternal, it's nothing like that, but it's created in response to the event. So it's a contingent thing on this revelation of truth. And all these terms, I know I'm just like I'm face palming saying them all, but you know, it's his version of the subject is this one created by the event that pays fidelity to it. It doesn't pre-exist, but it exists afterwards only by committing to the act and the act of revolution. Not political revolution, but whichever kind of revolution.
Yeah, it could include stuff like scientific revolutions, right?
The scientific revolution. St. Paul was a subject of Christianity.
Paradigms.
Yeah. So, I mean, this sounds very cool, you know, when he's talking about communism or something like that. The subject of the event of communism, we don't really have the event. We haven't seen it yet, or we saw some, but they weren't the ones that we wanted to continue, but we may see the next one. So the subject is produced by that event, and that's his response to a Lacanian subject, which is nothing, right? It comes from below the count. It comes from non-existence, and then it suddenly exists by putting faith into the event. This is like a revolutionary vision of the proletariat, that there's nobody, and then suddenly there are subjects. So I don't know, like, this isn't my style, I can say, but I can see why it's like cool.
Yeah, and it helps sort of answer that question of eternal truth versus the obvious fact that, you know, present is now in the here and now. So how does one relate to these sort of enduring truths about the world that philosophy supposedly gives us? And then where's the room for the revolution in that sort of picture of the universe of eternal and enduring laws that we can make true statements about? But then it's not going to tell us anything about this contingent life world of ours. It's just going to tell us sort of what to expect as a kind of pattern. Sure. But yeah, I mean, I can see this gesture as almost being very, philosophy as therapy or iatric versus philosophy as what we would sort of think of more narrowly as science.
I think a good example is that the truth, when it emerges, becomes eternal, which is not to say that it's eternal extending indefinitely into the past. But if you think of something like the liberal subject, like Hobbes, Locke, very liberal subject, the individual, in the terms that we use it today, like the individual never existed. There's no, and we still know there's not really such thing as an individual, because an individual means an atom, something that can't be split, something that doesn't have an unconscious, something that is only itself forever. But the liberal revolution created this so that we can only view all of history in terms of the individual. Like, why the hell was this Egyptian laborer building the pyramids when he wasn't going to go to heaven and his master was? That wouldn't have been a question. So part of what truth does is produce questions that would have been unaskable, or they wouldn't be possible. That these revolutions happen and they change the entire notion of what history was previously.
Which is, I guess, another interesting way of talking about it. I didn't encounter Badiou fully and early on.
Philosophy's purpose, in some sense, is then you're going to encounter these sutures that try to reduce the conditions of truth to something else, whether it's politics. Like Heidegger did this in his mind. Heidegger sutured his sutured his philosophy to politics, which is a kind of simple, hand-wavy example of why he became a Nazi, because he forgot his position as philosopher, which is commitment to truth procedures.
Badiou spends a lot of time highlighting Wittgenstein's sort of confessional side too. He's got this confessional side where he writes in his journal about religion and Christianity and becoming like a priest, and he has these questions. Right, that's interesting. Part of anti-philosophy is this sort of self-questioning, and he mentions early on one of the characteristics exemplified by Nietzsche is seeing kind of the priests sort of behind the scenes of the truth, right? The priests who encourage nihilism and benefit from it. And so it's almost like a kind of, again, like a kind of skepticism, those like as master of suspicion type of thing. I sort of thought of anti-philosophy almost as an extension of that as well, these masters of suspicion.
I'd say relative to the other, calls for renewal of philosophy or whatever, humanities that we've read, this gives the philosopher a very specific place. And it's not a very large place, and it's not a very important place, which I kind of like. But the philosopher in this sense becomes a sort of technician who has a certain disposition towards the objective world, and the world, objective world, I mean, as like a settled state of bodies and languages in his terms. But the world in general, like the world of people and the world of shit happening, doesn't really need philosophy at all, right? Because most people don't need philosophy either. It's a particular disposition. And the other broad calls for returning to the true call of philosophy, this is romantic at best and just really fucking stupid at worst. But he's kind of defining the parameters specifically enough to say, I, as a philosopher, have one job. Here it is. It's to identify the truth procedures of a certain event. what comes from the event, what doesn't come from the event, and then in the process I have to deal with anti-philosophy, this group of really intelligent, really noteworthy adversaries that I have to combat with in order to define my position as a positing philosopher. And I do kind of like that. I think it gives one of the most reasonable calls for philosophy that I've heard, because philosophy now is everything. Philosophy is like your brand or your disposition towards life, or theory, what we call theory. This is like sometimes called philosophy, and for good reason. I think we call it something else. But he gives very particular parameters for what this activity is supposed to do, which I kind of find refreshing in the sense that it's humble. I don't know if it's accurate. I really can't say, because you'd have to buy into all the terminology, but it's at least humble and specific.
I feel like what Wittgenstein does for him is shows the kind of emptiness of the linguistic turn, and kind of uses the linguistic turn as a way of completely deflating philosophy and sort of taking out its search for truth, kind of taking out, or like almost like flipping the conditions of that search for truth, that there's no truth in language, that language only speaks facts, but facts are not sort of in language, their sense is in the world. And so it sort of questions philosophy's ability to capture truths. Yeah, because if they speak eternal truths, states of affairs, but, the world is contingent, then in order to be true, something has to be both eternal, but then it has to be verified as actually happening. So there's truth and contingency are so close.
And this is one of the very few critiques of Derrida that I will actually accept. Because almost all the time when people are shit-talking Derrida, it's, truth, everything's relative, forget all that, which isn't what he was doing, of course. But what Badiou is saying he did is actually what he did, which is, I'm not going to pay attention to that stuff. I'm not going to assume that it is. I'm going to pay attention to the way in which linguistic truths are performed by supplements and alibi, and the way that language is used in philosophy. And I'm going to give up on that search for universal truth, because that's not what I'm interested in. But Badiou's criticism of Derrida as an anti-philosopher is actually correct, that he gave up on those things. Badiou is saying, I'm going to accept Derrida, but I want to be able to also get out of that to get to somewhere else. Now, personally, that somewhere else is not somewhere that I care to be, or I don't care about any of this terminology or any of this stuff, because I'm an anti-philosopher. But it's actually an accurate criticism for once, which is, relieving. Thank God.
Yeah. I mean, working with all these, working as a logical positivist seems kind of anti-philosophical in itself. And it's kind of interesting that this sort of densely philosophical book by Wittgenstein is like Wittgenstein is like an analytic philosopher you can take entire courses on, versus if you want to learn other things about analytic philosophy, it's usually just kind of topic based, which is kind of unique for an analytic philosopher who you just expect to be kind of dryly using symbolic logic to tell you about, the condition. You're learning truth tables and conditions of true statements. But here it has a really philosophical, like in the proper sense, kind of thrust to that whole dour enterprise. Wittgenstein is kind of fascinating in that way. Language only speaks kind of nonsense, right? Like the linguistic sphere of nonsense is just cloaked in sense. It kind of brings you up into contact with the nonsense. And it takes a lot of very careful, brilliant thinking to do that. So learning, like I just like it because it's like Badiou is showing you this way of being anti-philosophy, almost radical philosophy, and dealing with set theory and logic and things you would consider more instrumental and not geared for these kinds of purposes, but they certainly are. I'm convinced anyway by Badiou. I like I like it.
I can't help getting triggered from all of my memories of the analytical courses that I had to take. Because, yeah, that's super fun if you're interested in professionally solving Sudoku puzzles or figuring out if there's a hologram of a cat inside a room with no windows, and yet a Boltzmann brain appears in the room with no windows with the hologram of a cat who's on a hologram of a mat. Do you have justified true belief?
Well, I mean, those tools with some of the more broad purposes and goals of continental philosophy, right? Like, rarely does analytic philosophy have such grand aims as Wittgenstein, like to show that you know, yeah, that philosophical problems are really just problems with the way we understand language. And so he's going to solve those problems in that way. I mean, that's very deflationary of truth. And it's an interesting challenge, right? Like, an analytic philosopher wouldn't normally be worried by such results. They would just sort of go along with the idea that, yeah, truth is sort of guaranteed. It's not. Here, that concern shines forth, even with all the dense technical stuff. It kind of gives me hope. It's like complicated philosophy, and it can still have an air of rigor.
Truth being like a precondition that if we get the right description, then we're going to arrive at it, is very different from Badiou's version of the truth being something that is confirmed as having been, but after the fact, which is kind of radical. Do you think, though, there's something to be taken from the linguistic turn that he's not taking? Like, he's calling truth something that no one's really called it before. He's kind of making it up. Where do you get the authority in terms of like an arche? Where do you get the authority to be able to do that and just call it philosophy? Is there a sleight of hand there, do you think?
Oh, well, he calls what Wittgenstein's doing archaeaesthetic.
The Aristotle's definition of truth is just to say what is as it is. It's like pretty simple. If you have a representation that coincides with the actual state of affairs, then you're speaking truth, and otherwise you're speaking a lie. But this version of truth as being fidelity paid to an event that produces discourse, isn't that just redefining?
Well, I think the truth, the truth is the unsayable. And so he's, taking away, he's challenging this boundary between the sayable and the unsayable, and what is thinkable and what's unthinkable. What is it? That of which we cannot speak, there we must remain silent. Right. So what is sayable in terms of, propositions and statements conveying facts, but the true part is the unsayable, which is aesthetic. Yeah, like, philosophy is out of step with the conditions of truth if it's going to be all about what is sayable.
But does he defeat it from their perspective? I'm making more of a meta critique here. If you take truth and try to make it self-referential in the way that it's used here, is he trying to make an event out of truth that is then also true? Because clearly Aristotle's logic is not good enough for him, which is why it needs to be replaced. But truth for him then has to be true, which would track self-referentially, because in his mind, he is being faithful to his definition. However, if you're going to take the linguistic anti-philosophy, Wittgenstein, Derrida, at its sense-making, you actually haven't overcome their critique from that point of reference, have you? Because by redefining the central tenet of philosophy, logic and logical deductions as true, couldn't it just as easily be said that he's yet extending or playing a new language game and no more than that? I don't know. It's worth considering. But because we're a personal question, Eric, if we have all this considered and you have to pick a side, at the end of this, are you going to be on team philosophy or team anti-philosophy?
I think probably philosopher still, but with anti-philosophy. I wouldn't want to be without anti-philosophy, but I wouldn't want there to only be anti-philosophy either. It seems one is, almost, almost like the connotational, the ideological, and the other one is like the aesthetic, the metalinguistic, like in Barth's terms. One of them is totalizing and the other one's detotalizing, and they're complementary. One of them is life and movement.
I feel like I always fall into the philosophical mode by returning to arguments for things like correctness, for things like accuracy, for hermeneutic context. But I think, yeah, when you line up all the anti-philosophers, I'm like, dope. But they wouldn't exist without the philosopher having posited in the first place.
Yeah, I think they are like necessary, but also kind of dependent, because you wouldn't want to just read about, positively affirming the truth, pure affirmation all day. Because sometimes you just want to be fucking pessimistic.
Or sometimes you want to play.
Yeah.
Like, I think he would be very opposed to a Baudrillardian thesis of this just all being a game. The stakes seem rather higher for him. It's not a game. It's very serious. We must pay fidelity to the event.
So it's like the deflation of truth isn't final. It's a challenge to philosophy. Otherwise, philosophy would just sort of go on all puffed up over its own successes and never question.
Yeah.
And never question its basic motivations.
And the dialogue continues. So there we go. Anti-philosophy. Sorry for the difficult episode, if it was. Hope you got something out of it in any case. So I will see you guys later, and listeners, talk at you next time.
Bye.
Wow.